Yeah, well then, let's do this. All right, we're ready? All right. We're gonna get going here. We're gonna call to order the Shelburne Planning Commission meeting for Thursday, September 28th. Just to mention on the call to order, I think we will go ahead and skip the photograph again since we are not all together here. All right. Do we need a agreement on that, or is that cool to?
Just keep getting
All
by.
right. Next item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Do we have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
All right. Moved by Kate, seconded by Perry. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next item is approval of the minutes from last week. Do I have a motion to approve? Isn't that the order? Well, somebody has to
So moved.
motion first? Was there, and can that, Graham can do that, right?
I think he can.
Okay.
And if,
Cool.
yes, if you're worried,
I'm not worried. Okay, so, motion by Graham, second by Asim. Any discussion? And
It was very comprehensive.
I thought it was good too. I just had one point of clarity on the back of the first page under the energy section. I don't know if I actually said it or not, but my comment on noting the state goal was to say that by 2050, it was increasing sustainable or alternative power generation and reducing overall power consumption. So just adding the word either alternative or sustainable and overall, if that makes sense.
Where do you want me to insert that, sustainable?
Right after increasing, so increasing sustainable power generation and then reducing overall power consumption. And those are my only comments. Were there any others? All right. All in favor of approving the meeting minutes?
Aye.
Aye. All right. So next item is any disclosures relating to any potential conflicts of interest? We're all good tonight. Okay, no disclosures. The next item is open to the public. We do have members of the public.
Is this a rarity for you guys?
Recently, right? Yeah, exactly. So any comments during the open session?
No, we're interested in the rural stuff later.
Oh, excellent, cool. All right, I'll just make one comment that whenever you're talking, just grab the mic for when we get there. Cool. All right, then next item is around the energy subcommittee. Last time we had discussed forming a subcommittee, and it wasn't formally on the agenda, so now it is.
right. But unfortunately, the chair who makes the decision.
to do that.
He's not here.
Can we just move that agenda item down?
However, we have now approved the agenda.
You can,
You see the conundrum. All right. We could come back to that, right?
you certainly may.
Excellent.
If you really want to be technical, you can take a motion to table that and then bring it off the table? Is that, no, you don't need to do that.
I don't want somebody coming back and saying, due to a technicality, this subcommittee cannot happen now. If we're good just to circle that and come back, then we'll come back. Okay. So then, next item is the comprehensive plan update. And there was a memo included. Wait a second. That's different. Let's see. This was the note from Melanie.
Right, that was just providing some perspective having to do with the energy section update.
And I, just had some brief comments around that, and then I think we'd move on to the future land use. But regarding the energy policy, it threw me for a second when she mentioned there was a specific question around if the town could meet the standard if the policies were only focused on energy conservation and not necessarily generation. And I think I remember the question, is that something that we'd want to pursue per her memo?
My understanding is we're not going to get credit for it because of the way things are right now. There's not, it's nice, but you don't get credit for it. But that could change, and the town plan is for, are we at 8 years now, or still
Oh,
5?
This one, we're on the 5-year deadline for this one, but when we adopt a new plan, it will be 8 years.
It'll be
from then
8
on.
years. So I think we should be, kind of proactive thinking that, it's going to be easier to take into account conservation, savings from conservation methods. I think in general, that's where everything is sort of going, the kind of more careful calibration and stuff. And so I think that we should put it in the plan as something that we think is important to have, and maybe even, if possible, state that we would want to somewhat aggressively pursue that, if and when it becomes something that is given credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense she was just throwing a flag because she'd heard this sentiment expressed. Could we address the goals and the statutory requirements just by promoting conservation? And the simple answer is no. There's no way we can do it. And I think that even on a regional level, though we're one of 20-odd towns, if we were to say that, if that was to be the town's position, it would affect the numbers that the region has to try to meet. Because they've made some assumptions about the generation in each of the communities. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's in there, is because they would like heads up if Shelburne's position was, we're not going to be promoting generation like other communities would need to if they're going to have this Section 248 elevation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have this as part of the discussion, because of course, all things being equal, if we could meet goals through simply conservation, that would be great. So it should be part of the conversation, but I think the bigger issue is around whether or not we would get credit for that, right?
Right, and it's just, I think these assumptions could change in the course of 8 years. So I think it makes sense to have some language in the plan that enables us to be proactive in that way if there's an opportunity to get credit for it as time goes by.
Okay.
So it's not just all about energy generation, which is kind of how it's oriented right now, right?
Their targets are, or the credit for substantial deference is geared more toward that, but not what our town objectives might be.
Right.
I mean, the greenhouse gas stuff is driving the change, well, for the retrofitting of houses, weatherization, and the reduction in the use of oil for heat, and change over to electricity. So that's not achieved just by conservation.
Right.
Right. All right, so we'll keep that as a consideration, but I'm not, should we take see where people stand on whether or not we should let them know if we're intending to not go for generation or incent or?
Oh, I don't see them as having to be mutually exclusive. I was thinking that, right now, we have to do what we have to do. But I think we could have some language in there that addresses if, some of the assumptions for how this is calculated change over time. Shelburne is in a position to gain some credits through energy efficiency, because it just, we are trying to have a built environment that, at least in our growth areas, supports the ability to get around without having to use a car for every trip. And, cars right now they use fossil fuel, some use electricity. We're going to a future where they're expected to all use electricity. Well, if you can, not use your car for having every single trip, then you're saving on electricity. I just think this is very short-sighted.
So this would also be a consideration as we build whatever data sets we're working off of to ensure that we have proper baselines and proper things that we could measure against, so that we could show what efficiency has saved in order to make an argument in the future, should there be some sort of situation where there's a generation facility looking to be put in, and otherwise that would be part of needing, otherwise we might need to do that in order to meet the goals, versus being able to show through data, hey, this is what we've already achieved, do we actually need this plant? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's just like you get some credit for stormwater resiliency if you are able to avoid developing certain parcels. I mean, I don't understand why it's so difficult to apply the same kind of thinking to energy use. I mean, it's really the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is the statute's the statute.
Exactly.
That's
Right.
But the
I mean,
statute
Act
could
174 is what
could
it is,
change
and-
in the next 8 years.
Agreed. And maybe that's sort of the angle we go after, is just to the extent we can encourage our representatives and delegation to pursue opportunities to address conservation credits or something along those lines,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And the generation targets themselves that we've looked at periodically aren't in the town plan, right? That's not in a table.
You mean currently, or in the draft?
They're
that
not
she put in-
contemplated to be included, right?
The edits that she made.
I don't have those in front of me.
Are
Okay.
not included, yeah. She didn't insert those tables. There's, I think, a place for them, but they weren't there in the draft.
Yeah. Did we contemplate including that as an appendix, or have we thought about
I don't know that we've gotten quite
that far? Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the only piece that gives me pause, is I don't love, I think along the lines that Kate's thinking, I don't love putting a target out there and then being held to it because it's in a policy document for the plan, that's all. But if it's just supporting information, because those numbers will evolve, right? I mean, my understanding is that
They're modeling numbers.
right, they're being modeled and they'll be adjusted, right?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we haven't got the numbers inserted is because they're doing more modeling runs, and so I think they'll give them to us when they've done more this fall.
Yeah. Do they
Um,
get locked in the regional plan, in the ECOS plan?
I'm not sure
At
how
some
they'll,
point.
whether or not, they'll probably be in an appendix, I would guess, or they'll be referred to in some other standalone document. I don't think that the format of the ECOS plan lends itself to having it
No.
in the policy section, and I think the same thing goes, I don't think anyone at the RPC is going to lose sleep over our plan if it doesn't have the tables in the document and instead has them in an appendix.
Yeah. And maybe you're getting off track here, but the challenge for me is we're not doing, every town in the county isn't setting their plan at the same time.
Right.
So you're going to have this effect of, the numbers are going to change, right? Our allocation will change when Williston starts to do its plan again, and you have this cycle of like,
I don't know
Right.
how sensitive the modeling is, or
Yeah.
whether or not their modeling is going to really be dynamic enough to say, oh, well, then the Williston plan has got, so we're gonna tweak this, and then that's gonna change everybody else. I don't think, and so this
the
gives
fact,
you,
I guess what I'm thinking about is the fact that we may be overachieving as far as our generation may hinder other towns from pushing their own generation targets, right? Like,
Sure.
we may be an overachiever within the county.
Yeah.
And that's great, right? I mean, that's a great, for other reasons, that could be a great business marketing angle, it could be a lot of things for us, but from an equity perspective within the town, when they give us this, here's Shelburne's allocation, right? That's the only thing that I struggle with a little bit with how, maybe we should just keep that offline and not within the plan and.
Yeah, again, I don't think that there will be a problem with it not being on a page in the document. I think if the document acknowledges what we're trying to do and it's consistent with the numbers that they've developed, I think they would probably be okay.
Well, and hopefully the Energy Subcommittee, if it gets established, could provide some more information on residents' attitudes towards, how aggressively people support pursuing this. Once we're like, okay, well, this is what this could look like. Still on board, Are we not doing enough? Do we want, too much? We don't really have that information yet, so.
I think Melanie even did say that if these are their rules they're putting forth for substantial deference based on that checklist, but if we can show that we would still meet those goals outside of that, then we could take our own path. So from my perspective, if we do end up with proper data and we can establish proper baselines, then we can just formulate our plan to say, based on these baselines, here's what our targets are. However we meet those targets is however we meet them in order to achieve substantial deference. And they would need to see that we're on that path, I think.
Yeah, and I think the way the statute works is the RPC has to accept whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we do show we ended up tabling the formation of the Energy Subcommittee.
Okay.
So we can do that after
Yeah.
this item. But if we do gather data that we can put in there, that then we can go and show the RPC, hey,
Mhm.
this is what our approach is, then we would get that grant or the approval for substantial deference, and then less of an issue.
Mhm.
Any other discussion around this point?
I have a couple of comments.
Yeah.
One is that it seems to me that what she's asserting here in this in her statement, all of us agree that that's not true. So we should tell her that we do not necessarily agree, that we're only pursuing energy conservation and not generation. I think what my understanding is from the conversation that we'll pursue both. And we just want to kind of like make sure that both of them are included in this and not just energy generation, rather a mix of both the strategies. So I think a clear statement would be like to just respond to her and tell her that she's misunderstood what she stated in this.
Yeah, I don't think
So that's one thing.
okay.
And secondly, I think like we also raised this issue when she was here last time, like this issue of baseline. Like I'm not clear about how the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission is going to set up a baseline. Would that be a baseline on like say 2010 baseline year? When you say that, okay, this was a baseline year and then you have to reduce your kind of like greenhouse gas emissions or kilowatt hours consumed by 60%, or 80%, whatever, compared to that baseline year? Or is it more like a baseline trend? So you can have like a baseline trend line, and then you can kind of like say you will reduce your whatever indicator is below that baseline trend, which are two very different things. Because in one case you're like have a static point in time, the first case, and the other one is more like a dynamic trend. It's not clear to us like what they're going to do, and I think that needs to be clarified, like how they are implementing
I
that.
think that question is answered in some of the materials that were distributed back several months ago. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I do remember at least one of the features going back to some modeling year many years ago, and I think that was one of the problems, is that it was 2000. It had a base year a long time ago. But I'll try to get the answer to that question. And I will let her know that the Planning Commission is not intending to try to address this only through conservation. I do want to make it really clear, Asim, that she heard it because it was said, because I remember hearing it. It's not. It's,
question.
yeah, it wasn't.
I think we were asking a hypothetical at some
Yeah.
level, not purely hypothetical, but we asked it as far as
Yeah.
challenging.
And like I was saying earlier, I think she was concerned because if it was something that was going to be the position, it had implications for them. But I will let her know
Yeah.
now that we can say this. And I do think this is an important question to have resolved if we're going back to the question of creating the energy committee, if that issue is resolved, then it's nothing that they have to debate. You know, they're going ahead with the standard program, which is to develop the section to comply with the law.
Right.
Is this a good point to hand over the gavel?
Happy to
need a
take
gavel.
over. We continued the discussion of the Energy Committee, is that right?
Yeah, well, right now, we're in the middle of 7. We just discussed the energy point, the first bullet.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if while we're on that topic, if it makes sense to address the subcommittee, or if we should complete topic 7 before returning to number 6.
I think it might make sense to
Yeah, I agree.
integrate the two.
So let's just jump into that, right? The Energy Subcommittee request, I know there was a conversation about this at the last meeting, which I missed. Judy Raven's inquiry is included in the packet. I know she was here last time, right? So you had an opportunity to hear her out a little bit, and not dissimilar to, excuse me, the way we thought about the Housing Subcommittee when that was conceived. More hands on deck during a process like this can be a good thing. So we have volunteers in town who are very familiar with this topic, and it feels like we should certainly take advantage of that whenever we have hands going up and a resource that is willing to help us move the ball a little bit. I think it's a great idea. I don't know the others who might be considered. Has Judy shared?
She had not given me a formal list,
Okay.
although there were some names that were suggested by Jason you had a short list? Or was it Andrew? I'm sorry, it was Andrew. It was
Okay.
Andrew. And I shared the names on that list, and 2 of the 3 were people that Judy had on her list. I remember one of the people that was on both lists was Tobin Galvin, Susan Megenberg's
Oh, sure.
husband.
Yeah.
Another one was Chris Nemi, a former member of the Planning Commission many, many years ago, former Select Board member.
Mhm.
And the third name escapes me,
Okay.
but at least those first 2, pretty intensely involved in the energy field. And I would only hope that they would have time. And maybe you've worked with them, Asim, I don't know. Have you worked with either of them?
I don't think I can for this particular subcommittee. I can definitely review the documents, but
No, I was just wondering if you knew either of the 2 people whose names were mentioned, Tobin.
oh yeah, I know Susan and Susan's husband very well.
Mhm. So, following that discussion at the last meeting, did we kind of reach consensus on this? Seems like a good idea. Have we already had that conversation? I don't want to retread the ground if we've already done that. Okay.
If they could have formally dealt with it, I think they would have, because
Okay.
it wasn't on the agenda, but.
We haven't really sketched out a charge
That's right.
specifically for
So
this,
that could be
so
discussed.
could we do 2 steps? Could we should we just pause on creation of the subcommittee until we have a
The creation-
draft charge to review as a group, or does it make sense to just get?
I think it depends on how involved you want people to be. The way that it was handled last time was the group made the decision that the chair could appoint this committee, and that's what happened. If that model is used again, but there was the development, didn't Ron even propose the charge?
I think he did.
Do you want
Not really.
yeah, I don't know how you
Yeah.
want to approach that. I mean, is the focus initially to simply work on the comprehensive plans energy section?
Was that discussed at all? I'm sorry to
No, you're
rehash
fine.
this stuff if it was already.
A lot of what was discussed is the fact that we're going to need data
Right.
for a lot of what we're looking for, and that a subcommittee could help pull that together.
Okay.
I think, were there other main points? I think if I had to distill it down.
Okay.
I think data was the main
Data-
main item, right? I think if you're talking about a charge, maybe like adding something like that data can be analyzed to lead to some useful analysis, like say if they can calculate some kind of like cost abatement curve, like say, okay, if you can find these kind of energy conservation is probably cost effective, but in some cases it is, in other cases it's not. But there are other kinds of technologies like geothermal versus
Right.
solar versus micro wind that we talked about. Each one of them have different costs associated with it in terms of like abatement of greenhouse gas emissions or like reduction of kilowatt hours consumed per person or household. So I think if they can kind of like not just generate the data, but also have some kind of preliminary analysis done on some kind of abatement curve, that would be useful.
Yeah, one of the most interesting things that for me, that we learned last meeting was Asim explained about these new technologies for the micro wind, which immediately made me think, Route 7. It's a noisy place, lots of wide open spaces. Maybe this could be something that would work very well with that. And, even become some kind of public art thing that feeds into Shelburne identity, I don't know. So anyway, I was kind of thinking, like, I'd love to know, I think that would be very well supported by the majority of residents, that if we are required to meet these levels of generation, the degree to which we could sort of kind of co-locate that on Route 7 with some cool-looking things that people think are, interesting, at least aesthetically, that might be sort of a win-win and kind of, limit the impacts, which I know there's going to be great concern about, of having these things proliferate in our potentially in our rural areas. So, anyway, I thought that was really worthwhile to get some information about, because at the end of the day, we have to tell them, do we prefer wind? Do we prefer solar? Do we prefer, how we're going to meet these goals and where we're going to put these things. That's what we have to do.
Okay, I think I got it. So my only other question, and this may be a Dean question, I know there had been some conversation about, we had this energy advisory group, right? It dissolved at some level. Was there any?
There was an energy committee that was never a
Right.
town-sponsored group, and that was what Judy was involved in, and they've kind of faded off. But,
Okay.
they did provide some comments on the last iteration of the plan, the energy section. Yeah, they were largely responsible for cutting back on the number of recommended actions. So they did contribute.
Okay. So just to reconfirm before I think I do this, correct? On my own, it's not a motion with a,
I believe that the commission might have been so formal last time as to adopt a motion saying that
Okay.
the chair could do it.
okay,
So you
let's
might
do
wanna
it that way
again.
since that worked well for this subcommittee, but just for the group. So data generation and validation, analysis and review of the town plan energy section, consideration of, what would you say, techniques such as a cost abatement curve? Micro wind generation analysis. And I was thinking review of neighboring town plan energy sections to the extent time permits, right? I mean, this could be a lot on one subcommittee's plate, but
Yeah, I'm trying
to
to
the
think.
extent we can just, make sure we get a gut check on, are we in line generally, right? I would think we probably are, but I just, without any of us doing that, I don't know if you've done that, I don't know if Melanie's sort of looking at, when she had edited it, is she pulling things in from?
Yeah, not every community is on the same schedule, so they may not have to update their plans under the new legislation, so the broader requirements. And then fewer still would be getting the elevated status. I think Heinsberg might be in a similar track. I don't believe South Burlington. So in terms of neighboring communities, I think there are other towns. Colchester is working on this same kind of approach. I think they're going a little bit more slowly, perhaps.
Okay.
I don't know that Charlotte did, or has yet.
I think these were all in there, but the priorities I was hearing was the data to support metrics to measure improvement, like baselines and that sort of thing.
To measure improvement?
Yeah, is we need to have something to be able to measure off of. And then to determine the cost effectiveness of various efficiency measures. Which I'm assuming that the cost abatement curves and those sorts of things would fit under that.
Yeah, I mean, to measure that cost effectiveness, so not only of the various efficiency measures, but also, like renewable energy technologies. So it's not just energy efficiency or conservation, but also,
Where do you
say
get
like,
more bang for the
you
buck?
say, for example, if you want to replace your, like a oil-based heating system with take the incentive that Green Mountain Power is offering right now to replace it with geothermal baseboard kind of technology. That's kind of like a long-term investment. It pays itself off, but it's like, I think return on investment is like 12 years or something like that. So it's kind of like comparing the technologies, not just the efficiencies.
Which would be a helpful guide, because then we could
Yeah.
determine where to do promotional type things and
Absolutely, yeah.
education.
I think that would be very, very useful, if you can, especially for our context, like, given like how much sunlight do we get in this town and how much wind we get, so they can actually calculate exactly how much would it cost, what would be the return on investment for a given technology.
Well, that's another thing to maybe prepare some kind of, just in terms of a data layer, that maybe this already exists with the state, but a map that shows where is the prevailing wind, like where's the best places for solar, so that we have that information.
Yeah, those
The-
maps have been.
That we have,
Yeah,
right?
The RPC
Yeah,
has.
The RPC
Yeah.
has
Yeah,
that
the
done.
wind maps, last ones I've seen are a few years old, but they have been done.
So can we just repeat that last one that you want to see more?
From a charge perspective, to
Yeah.
determine the cost effectiveness of various efficiency measures.
So it's cost effective, it's cost driven. Is that the
Well,
idea? When you say
it-
cost to the town, or?
Yeah, my definition of cost is different. It's more, like, I'm thinking in terms of opportunity costs, like if you have a choice between two efficiency measures, which one is
Yeah.
going to give you the better return?
Got it.
And then that would be the one we'd want to promote.
This is gonna get, I'm not a modeling expert, but I've worked with models, and I'm thinking of a newly created committee
Right.
that's gonna be given a charge like this, and there's gonna be, just the things that I've heard, to start to answer these questions, are gonna be tons of assumptions
Yeah.
that have to be established.
I agree.
And-
I wonder,
And I would say it's this, well, for a subcommittee, it wouldn't be, hey, here are three things to guide what it is you're supposed to work on, and if you don't have this done in 3 months, then we're going to put your names on a website. Like, it's just,
yeah,
I think it's more that here's how we're trying to narrow down, because we do have, I think one of the things that sparked this conversation was that there was a section inserted to promote the use of wood district heating. And then we kind of got into a discussion around, well, how efficient would that be compared to something else? And it's more if we do have people in the energy field or familiar with that could provide input, references, point to studies, that sort of thing, then that could help. Would we actually really want to promote that, or would we perhaps want to promote something different instead?
I think also residents would like to know that our recommendations or proposal for what we end up doing to achieve substantial deference was grounded in, science and facts, what's effective. So
maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's because I agree with you. I feel like with this committee, it might be asking too much to sort of get into this technical
Asking a
work that I
lot.
think sounds more like a university professor than a group of lay townsfolk. So maybe it's research, right? Research to help the planning commission assess the effectiveness of various efficiency measures, including techniques such as cost abatement curves. And we can give them a few examples that they can go off and do their Googling or networking throughout the town and within their, right?
But I mean, I don't.
I think that would be helpful for us just to say, okay, here's some information that the subcommittee uncovered without an expectation of they're going to deliver this
Yeah.
model.
I think a
or-
lot depends on who ends up being on the committee. I
Yeah.
mean, Tobin and Chris probably could do those things. They would, go back to their offices and create a Shelburne model, most likely. But I don't know that you'll be sure to have them, and which model's the one, if they couldn't agree on the model, then what do we do? But I think that what you're saying is do research and come back with information about the kind of relative benefits. That's a start. You can start to react to that. And then you could use that to answer the questions that Kate's talking about, because people will say, well, why are you promoting this over that? And you say, well, here's this research that backs that up. Now, someone who's really in the weeds will say, yes, but if you apply that research in a model, then that's version 2.
Asim, do you think there's, any interest at UVM in being involved in this sort of project?
Oh, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people are engaged in this. Like, there is Gun Institute for Environment just now. There are a bunch of people who are doing studies all over. Also with the Department of Public Service Commission, as well as at the state level, but also at the Regional Planning Commission levels, with the Burlington cities, town government. So, there are a lot of these kind of different studies that are being concurrently done and all over. So, I mean, I think if the town is really interested in getting an answer to some specific question, we can find relevant experts. But then it's a question of their time and payment and all that.
Right.
And I think
It
fundamentally.
seems
what
like
we're-
this is volunteer.
Right.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think what we're looking for is just input to the process that's going to end up having text in our town
Yes,
plan. And
I agree.
And again, where we got off onto that tangent was because there was a section around wood district heating, and is that as efficient as something else? And then we started batting around different things. And
Right.
so if a subcommittee could even find studies or other sources that have done some analysis that we could reference, that would guide decision-making on what's included in the plan.
Okay. So I'm going to flip this, all right? So I think what we want to do is keep the eye on the prize, right? We really want this group to review and comment on the draft energy section that's been reviewed, submitted by RPC, provided, Jason's comments and leadership on that. So that's sort of the high level. From there, suggested areas of research and support will also include this piece we just talked about, research to help the Planning Commission assess relative cost efficiency measures, well, you'll sketch this out, but the idea is to put these bullets, data generation and validation of figures within the current draft, analysis and review of other relevant town plan energy sections that are pursuing Act 174 substantial deference, such as Heinsberg,
Colchester.
Bennington,
Oh,
right?
Bennington. was
Bennington,
earlier,
Colchester, just to name a few, right?
Yeah,
If they have
within
time
Vermont.
to just take half an hour and look at those and bring in relevant copy for us to look at, that would be great. And we should probably just add the micro wind generation as a separate, to the extent they have time or knowledge in that area. It would help us just to educate ourselves.
Or just investigation of available technology to support energy goals.
Yeah, I agree. Casting a broader net in terms of the technologies.
Investigation of available technologies. Okay, such as micro wind generation. Based on those priorities and that charge, is the group comfortable if, without me finalizing this in real time, is the group comfortable delegating that to me to pull together with Dean, and then we'll circulate to the group?
100%
Okay.
comfortable.
So if I make a motion to create the energy subcommittee tonight with a proposed charge as aligned and agreed to, will that
All
be
good.
acceptable to the group? Okay. Okay, I would like to make a motion to establish the Shelburne Energy Subcommittee of the Planning Commission. I propose a draft charge with the primary mission being review and comment to the draft town plan energy section, which will include various sub-initiatives as discussed this evening. The only additional point that I would make is that it's a temporary subcommittee. Is there a
That was a
second?
point that Judy
Yes,
thought would attract people.
yes, a temporary subcommittee.
So
Not
moved?
the most elegant motion, but
You're finished, you
I am
finished the motion?
finished.
Okay, so moved?
Second.
all in favor? Aye. Okay. We have an energy subcommittee.
Whew. All right.
Next item on our agenda is, did we already talk about the housing subcommittee?
No, there was no discussion of that.
Okay.
And so the floor is
Let's
yours.
talk about that. And that will be a good segue into the rural area discussion that we'll jump back into in the comp plan. So the housing subcommittee, as everybody knows, has done some strong, valiant work to develop the Housing in Shelburne booklet, which we've reviewed several times, and which I think it's about at the point where it's final. Ron, myself, Dean met a couple weeks back to think about how might that group evolve. And what we kept coming back to was, we've spent some good time on the rural district conversations, and we've struggled a little bit with trying to frame up some of the actions that would be helpful for us, whether it's a build-out analysis, whether it's studies, whether it's some more tactical type of deliverables, such as looking at one or two particular sites and showing what, a future build-out might look like, or how a conservation subdivision might look if it were configured differently. So Ron suggested, and I think we agreed, that it'd be nice to evolve this group to help us to steer it into more of a resource for rural district study. And that could take the form of any of those things. We really didn't get beyond, here's some ideas that we think could be relevant and interesting to the Planning Commission and helpful to the town. So I told Ron we'd discuss that. I think we'd need to amend the charge to include whatever we decide the scope of that 2.0 mission will be. We're fortunate to have a great group there that's still on board. We have Mark Brooks, we have Brian Precor, Ron Bouchard, Pam Bragnon, of course. So we have people who are ready and willing to continue to volunteer their time for the town. And it just seemed like a good opportunity to grab that while we can, since we have a lot on our plate. And this is an area that I think is of interest to the town at a high level and could use a little bit of additional support.
Also championing,
Yes.
yeah.
So I think what we wanted to do tonight was try to align on what that future charge might be. Is that right, Dean?
Yeah, because I have a strong awareness of their desire to do more and to contribute, including in areas of the town like the rural area. When I think of the kinds of things that they might do, I also think about how it's an area that's also of great interest to the Natural Resources Committee.
Correct.
And so how do we find is it a dividing line, and what is that dividing line between the stuff that the Housing Committee would work on as opposed to the Natural Resources Committee? And you have a retreat coming up in the end of October,
Right.
where some of the work that you do expect the Natural Resources Committee to do can be made even more clear. And I also do think about the kinds of contributions that the Housing Committee could make to the update of the plan in the same way that this energy group could do the same, in the same way that the Natural Resources Committee could.
And when we met, I was thinking, in addition to, yes, they'd be a good resource to help progress the town plan rural district section, I thought a little more broadly, beyond just they could really help us above and beyond what we're trying to do in the town plan with the Natural Resources Committee, and just felt like a good opportunity to jump in. And
Yeah.
division of labor, Gail's here, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this idea generally. I suspect your group wouldn't be threatened by having a group like the Housing Subcommittee help be an additional resource, as long as we're not sort of working against each other. Or if we're clear on what do we want this group to do specifically, so that it's not working against whatever the Natural Resources Committee is doing, so that we're collaborating instead of.
Yeah, and I'm not sure whether it might be worthwhile to invite them as well, once they're formed, to our retreat.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good idea.
And the Housing Committee's been going on,
It's-
so they exist. Yeah, they're-
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it exists, and the thinking is, they've developed this Housing in Shelburne booklet, which has been essentially, 95% complete at this point, so they're ready to do more. And we have 2 former chairs of the Planning Commission on that subcommittee. We have a former planning commissioner, we have Mark Brooks, that's his field, so
Yeah.
he's.
And Ron had worked with us
Right.
earlier also.
Yeah, it just felt like a good opportunity to pull them in. And we just sketched out some ideas, not really having a concrete plan of what they might do, other than, yes, please help us, because there's a lot of work to do here, and I think the town is at a point where we really need to focus in on.
And I don't want to take away from things that Kate might be saying later under the rural section, but in terms of the rural parts of the town, if you put them on the spectrum, if we, acknowledge Kate's idea that there could be hamlets formed out of the rural area, we've got sort of the middle ground, and we have the areas that are really important from a natural resource perspective. Maybe the Housing Committee could be working on that hamlet piece. I mean,
Sure.
because that's where you'd want to see housing located.
Well, and it would seem like if we decide to pursue that sort of three-pronged approach of the conservation area, the more rural ag area, and then the hamlet area, there would be 3 very different types of housing forms in each sector. So they could be helping to, kind of evaluate some of the criteria for what those might be. And I think, the more people, this is going to be a big change
Right.
for the town, a way of thinking about things. Really important, I think, to get as many people, like a kind of crowdsourced approach to this. Well, I think we'll get more buy-in, and it will seem, a more thoughtful, considered process, I think, to most Shelburne residents. So just trying to, didn't go so well when the last time, trying to avoid those kinds of outcomes, because I think we're at a really critical threshold.
I think so.
So,
I think they've
Yeah.
done some really relevant work as well that could be translated into helping communicate to the town. I keep going back to this build-out analysis, because when I saw that, and we all saw that map that showed the progression of just complete sprawl into the rural district, and even taking something like that and pulling it into some kind of piece that we could either, put on the town's website, somebody could just actively start engaging once we start to frame this up a little more
because
concretely.
the really interesting thing is that, so that shows assumptions based on our current zoning. So you could have well, what would that look like if we made some different assumptions? And then, maybe even some more kind of extreme assumptions. And then almost kind of put it to a vote to we could survey people, what do you think? What do you want our future to be? And if so, then that means each, that would dictate that we then pursue certain things in the zoning bylaw to make that happen.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and just seeing the way conversation proceeds these days, the more people who are engaged, I think, the better, and the more perspectives that are brought into the
Agreed.
conversation, the better.
Yeah, and Pam's fantastic. I mean, she's just a great resource that can help do a lot of that GIS work, a lot of things that, we need this to be visual. I think that's the only way these concepts get communicated well
Yeah.
to the town. The narrative doesn't work. It doesn't
No.
work at all. It works
Yeah.
for us, and it works for people that are in the weeds and actually read this, but it doesn't work for,
And I think the
majority of
visuals and
people.
comparative visuals can be very powerful.
yeah, so okay. So it sounds like we have general alignment on evolving that charge. Again, I think what I'd like to do is I have to take another look at the current charge, but I think we'll just come back at the next meeting with proposed amendments to that charge, if that's fair. Well, it doesn't need to be hard and fast. I do like the idea of focusing on this hamlets, and it should be somehow tied to housing, right? The nature of this group should still be, how do we use that housing knowledge and the work they've already done to help take the next step,
Well, and I think it's,
focused on the rural
Document available
district.
at this point, or is it
It's available. It's
is it on the
not,
website?
Well, they have, I was going to ask Ron after their meeting on Monday, October 2nd, if they considered it in its form to be posted on the website, because I haven't posted it on the website in its form.
Because I think we meet again, I think, on the 13th, which is before our likely meeting together. And I think it would be really good if we could have available copies at our next meeting or before our next meeting to look over and take into the context of the conversation that we have in prep for the retreat.
I agree. Yeah, we can certainly send you the current draft. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of material in there to digest, and some of it's reference material, some of it's actually custom analysis that I think they did. But it will be good for you to have it. So let's do that. We'll come back to the group at the next meeting with a proposed charge, at which point we'll consider a motion to amend the current housing subcommittee charge with a new focus on the rural district.
And I think that the meeting on Monday is the first one that they would have had after receiving the comments that came out at the last meeting.
Okay.
Yeah.
I should also mention there's one vacancy on that housing subcommittee. We have 3 interested candidates. I've spoken to one
great.
today. He sounded very good, very quantitative in the real estate background, so I think he'd be a good fit. We have a couple other people that expressed interest, so we'll fill that vacancy at the next meeting as well. Dean, if you could just jot that down for the agenda.
Thank you.
I'll make the appointment. Okay. So let's segue back into
Bless
the comprehensive plan update with a discussion of the rural area. And I think we'll turn it over to Kate, who has taken the time here to sketch out how we might manage rural area growth pressures.
Yeah, sure. So, similar to what we had been just discussing, the idea is, why do this? And really, the reason is that under our current land use regulations, we can expect that substantial growth will occur over time, and that the result will be a kind of creeping suburbanization of our rural areas. And that this will create impacts that in all likelihood, will degrade the qualities that people really like about the town in the first place. So, so the purpose is to try and provide for and manage the expected growth pressures, but in a way that preserves the rural areas. And so that, by preservation of the rural areas, what I mean is conservation as much as possible of some of the town's most precious natural resource areas, and that includes scenic views as well as actual natural resources, such as water resources, habitat, for contiguous forest, things like that. So, but it also means preservation of our agricultural character, which we would really like to support and see going forward. And while we are, probably unlikely to have, giant dairy farms in Shelburne, or not too many of them at least, there's an awful lot going on in farming. The tendency now is towards smaller farms that do a lot more value-added kinds of things. So, so how can we support that and not make that something that's adversarial with housing, which I think it has been, kind of the trend. So, is there a way to limit housing in where we would like to encourage farming and to organize it in a way that is supportive of farming? So, and then the third thing would be to, right now we just sort of we have the town's growth area, which is serviced by the town's sewer, or has the potential to be, and then it just abruptly stops, and then we have rural. And so it's taking a finer-grained approach to that. And maybe there are some places in the rural area where we could have a kind of transition area from the rural, from the growth area into the rural area. And so, sometimes logical places can be places where a couple of roads meet, or where there might be existing small parcels of land. This might be an area where we could encourage, it might be appropriate to encourage more infill development, and also very large parcels of land too. Places that we think of as big open areas, unless they're conserved, there's no guarantee that they're going to remain that way. So we have to think about, well, what we'd like to have happen. Right now, there's 5-acre zoning allowed throughout the town's rural areas, and that doesn't seem like that's a good fit with some of our the emerging priorities for this area, and certainly not with the recommendations in the recently approved open space plan, which I encourage everybody to take a look at. So, what I did was I just was thinking about this. I thought maybe some broad management objectives and then some more specific management objectives. And so I thought that we have the recently approved open space plan, and if that might be a really logical document to use as a kind of to get us organized around vision, priorities, goals, and practices. It's something that our elected officials are familiar with, and was really created very thoughtfully and in a very transparent way. Anyway, that was sort of the thought there. And then I wanted to really figure out what do we mean by having more support of agricultural land uses, and as mentioned before, how this would integrate with residential uses. And then the idea of using hamlets, that my idea is that these hamlets could absorb a lot of the anticipated growth. And they would basically be ways to incorporate this growth in ways where it makes sense for it to happen. And so some criteria could be new extensions to the existing settlement patterns, correlation with existing road patterns, scale of existing buildings, and land uses. So the idea is to identify factors that would support maintaining the town's unique character into the future in the rural areas.
Can I
Sure.
interrupt? When you think about number 3, is that along the lines of the integrated ag bylaw?
Yeah, that would be, like, I think a good starting
example of
point.
a-
I'm wondering if we could beef that up
Mhm.
and really, you know, it sounds like a document that could use a little bit of work. And I attended the municipal planning day a couple weeks ago.
good.
And we had a presentation by the ag folks, and they used our, what's it called? Is it a part of our, is it an ordinance or part of, I'm forgetting?
The bylaw?
Yeah, it's just the bylaw, right?
The
It's just-
integrated ag bylaw?
It's just a separate
new one?
bylaw, yeah. They used, yeah, so they used that, and then they also looked at from a couple of other towns. And I thought, you know, that might be worth kind of looking at what other folks are doing and getting some ideas that might be useful. Like, one of the things that was, I thought, very interesting was that if you want to support agriculture, have a buffer, and let's say there's a rural subdivision, have a buffer, an ag buffer around the subdivision to protect the farm rather than the other way around. You know, it's been sort of seen as if housing kind of has more primacy, and in this to really put the farm first. You know, so that was just one thing that struck me as something worthy of some more thought. But anyway, there are some interesting, there's at least 3 or 4 of these bylaws that exist
Yeah,
that
remember
we could look at.
Publications that I can think of, I think one is a VNRC publication, one's a NOFA publication. I think Shelburne Farms was involved with a third publication.
But
So
there-
if you want to delve into.
There's some other towns too, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are a couple of towns that have them as well.
I'm talking about reports that feature some
Oh.
of those towns. If you're talking about example of towns that have things like that, yeah, they exist.
Yeah, I wrote down in my notes the
Yeah, I mean, I
ones
remember we
that are.
talked about this when we just went through this,
Yeah.
right?
So
When
I'm
we
not
looked
sure, are
at-
you just,
yeah.
if you want material, well, I can help you with at least 3 separate reports on the topic about ag generally.
Okay.
And how land use policies can be used to promote it. I thought it matched what you were saying.
Yeah, and I can get Stephanie Smith's notes on the, you know, or her presentation that she gave at the municipal
Yeah, that'd be
planning day
great to see
too.
that.
Because she had, basically, she was showing slides, well, this is what Shelburne does, you know, and the emphasis is on this, and this is what another place does, and this is the, you know, and there were a couple of different sort of orientations, and it was very interesting.
And when you think about hamlets, you know, is that analogous to how we thought about nodes in the corridor?
Yes, yeah, that would probably be sort of
Similar,
similar.
right? Where
But the
there's a-
rural version of that,
Right.
and it would have, I would think it would have less, in most instances, you know, unless there was a compelling reason to, I would think it would have less density than what's in the growth area. Would be a
Right.
very definitely a kind of transition
Yeah.
to the rural area. But, and I think form-based code could be a really good tool to use for that, because it would provide a little bit of predictability, and we could really organize whatever the pattern that we are hoping happens around criteria like resources to protect, views to protect, you know, things like that.
Okay.
Are you allowed to ask questions?
Please.
in this, or- Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
If you could just state your name
Speaking to her,
for the
yeah.
record.
So I'm Jonathan Harris. This is my sister Amanda Herzberger. I just moved up to Vermont about a year and a half ago. I was born up here from New York, and we own High Acres Farm, which is a pretty big rural zone of about 176 acres within Shelburne Farms. So we're really interested in this question of what's going to happen in the rural district. Our mom passed away about a year and a half ago, and we've been trying to decide what to do with this enormous property that we inherited and don't want to live in as a private home anymore because it's too extravagant for us. So we're wanting to explore kind of other things that can happen in a big open rural space. So we heard that you guys are kind of rethinking that space, and we wanted to come hear about it. I'm really curious also about this hamlet idea, and like when I think of hamlets, I think of the English countryside where you have these kind of little clusters of human settlement with, a bakery and a store and a cafe and a pub, kind of surrounded by farmland. Do you mean them in that sense, or is it more in the kind of American suburban sense of a cluster of homes, but you're still driving to get your groceries and to get your bread? Or are you actually imagining like little locuses of human community out in the countryside?
Well, that would be my preference. But yeah, we'd have to see what the appetite is for what people want here. But I don't think that's out of the question.
Because I know, like, we looked into what's currently permissible in the rural district, and I know there's like integrated agriculture. Which are you guys from the vineyard? Yeah, I think you kind of put that together. Is that right? And bread and butter farm.
Together, foreign with us, I guess.
Foreign with. So it seems like that's one of the contrivances the town has to allow kind of other kinds of stuff to happen in a rural zone. But in that case, it's very tied to agriculture. Like you have to be, teaching about the crops you're growing, or you have to be selling in your store the crops you're growing in some way. So I think we'd be excited also to start exploring, instead of agriculture, what about just culture? Like, are there cultural uses that would make sense in these rural areas? Because, as you mentioned, like the definition of what agriculture is evolving, and people are starting to create these more kind of value-added products rather than just doing the big dairy farm of days of old. And in similar ways, are there other forms of human community and human activity that make sense in these kind of rural settings that might not literally be farming per se, but might have a similarly kind of harmonious nature with the landscape around them? And just trying to maybe think about that in the planning process. Maybe integrated cultural could be another zoning class to sit alongside integrated agriculture, for instance. So anyway, I just wanted to plant a few of those
great.
seeds.
And what kind of activities would you have in mind when you think about, or when you reference cultural?
Yeah,
What does that mean to you?
We're just in the earliest stages of trying to imagine all this stuff. We just finished a renovation of the old main house, which we're hoping to be able to operate someday as a kind of retreat center where we can host groups of scholars and artists and writers visiting from all over the world. In connection with those retreats, we've talked about possibly wanting to offer workshops and classes that local folks can attend, and also lectures and film screenings and performances and kind of public conversations in connection with some of those gatherings. So kind of like a campus environment in a way that has this kind of learning aspect to it, but could also involve things like performances and classical music concerts and film screenings and this kind of thing. What other things have we talked about?
I mean, that's the majority. That's really what we hope. As John said, we don't want to live in the house, and so our hope is to find a way to preserve the property and preserve the open space. So sort of in support of that idea, and we've met with Dean and Caitlin and are starting that conversation with just figuring out what exists, what could exist, where we could fit in, and so similarly to what John said, it seems like there's a conversation happening now, and we just felt like it was important to be a part of it, and we're just at the very beginning. So I feel like those are sort of the factors of what we're hoping to do, and then at the same time we're also starting to do some like a weekly rental so that there can be some income coming in. So we sort of have a tiered approach of sort of income generating, and then more culturally sort of mission driven, which is kind of the retreats, that sort of thing, the performances and that sort of thing. But our hope is really all of this comes from a desire to conserve the land and really keep the rural nature of it, because that's something that we've enjoyed, in our lifetime, and certainly have a lot of respect for, being connected to Shelburne Farms and to Meach Cove, and just the beauty of that open space. So the desire to protect that.
If I could just interject.
Please.
Where are we? So if you look on the map here, you want to hold that?
Where the red,
The red dot, that's sort of south of the black line is the Stearns, and where the sort of L-shaped lot that's just this sort of the,
Oh, yeah.
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 Google map us into it. So we're south of Quaker Smith Point. That's Quaker Smith Point. There's the Stearns house, yeah, so we're that, yep, right where his house is. So, and just to give you a sense, there's a main house and caretaker's cottage. There's a few outbuildings that have been around since 1953 when the property was split off, and so we're just sort of reimagining those as we. Isn't technology amazing?
Yeah, and I think there's the direct example of what we're interested in exploring with our land, but then it's also exciting that you're thinking about this in a more general way for the town. And I think we're all probably sad that there's a big highway going right through the center of our little village, and thinking how different that would feel if it were a more kind of a walkable downtown core. But maybe it would be interesting to start thinking about like satellite hamlets, that other parts of Shelburne are little locuses of human settlement that can be designed with cars as second-class citizens rather than first-class citizens, and that are really designed, like, I don't know if you guys have explored the writings of the architect Christopher Alexander at all, who wrote a pattern language back in the day. In his newer book, The Nature of Order, he talks about kind of different zoning strategies for human clusters of human life in rural settings that are just so beautiful and inspiring. And cars are kind of tucked away in little lots with like 2 to 3 spaces each. And there's walking trails connecting all the spaces, and all the buildings form positive outdoor spaces like courtyards together. So very different from the American suburban thing where everyone has their little lawn and it's like 25 feet to the next guy. It's anyway, I'm sure you've researched all this too, but I just get inspired thinking about like having little clusters of human activity all around Shelburne, kind of in this beautiful harmony with the natural landscape, sensitively sited, and not just homes, but a critical mass of activity where people can actually meaningfully have a community there. So anyway, blah blah blah. But this is really cool to kind of hear that this is unfolding here in the town right now.
I think it's great. Thank you for the comments, and
Yeah.
it's very timely.
It
And,
is.
Expansive vision.
It is, yeah, and I think the time is right to listen to how we're thinking about this, and also for us to just soak in how you're thinking about it
Well, I
as
think-
well, and what the opportunities might be to revision this district, which is sort of the bigger picture, right? Which is
Yeah,
why
because
we're
it's
doing
like
this.
it's like we're all, we grew up in this beautiful agricultural landscape, and yet, and some of us are still farming in different ways. But that even is, as you said, that's morphing and changing and evolving. And so, yeah, just thinking about that, what's the highest and best use of a beautiful natural landscape today in 2017, given the world. So anyway,
No,
thank you.
Thank you.
If I could
It's a lovely
interject.
vision.
Yes, please.
Very
Yeah.
quickly, about 15 years ago, John and Mary Abele came to the Planning Commission, came to the town with a proposal for a center that would host conferences and experts and do some of the cultural type things that Jonathan was just mentioning. And they started the review process, and for various reasons, they never concluded it. But it was possible for them to propose that in the rural district, just south, owing to a feature of the zoning regulations that not very many places in Shelburne qualify for. Meach Cove's property does, Shelburne Farms does, this property doesn't, owing to its size. So among the many, many possible changes that could be considered as far as the town's policies and regulations, you have the rural historic mixed-use PUD provisions, but you can't buy into that unless you have 450 acres. And so that's a number that allows things like Meach Cove to consider it and Shelburne Farms, but not this property. If the town, if we could get to it later and look at the entire rural area and the parcels and get a sense of the larger parcels, that's another approach possibly for where some of these
Bringing down
nodes
that-
might be.
Yeah,
If they became eligible for the rural mixed-use PUD,
right.
then people could plan these kinds of things. It's just that right now, the barrier is really high because it's at 450 acres.
So where did that 450 threshold come from?
Where did that 450 acres come from? It was before I was here. I haven't seen anything that documents it, but my guess is that it probably was, among other things, factoring in not too many places being eligible, but it certainly had to be low enough to make Shelburne Farms eligible.
As I understand it, Alec Webb actually wrote that PUD bylaw into the code, or substantially worked on it, and I think probably in doing so, he factored in, okay, how many properties in Shelburne would be eligible for this, and it was like
I mean, there are
Shelburne Farms and one other.
a lot of people are afraid of the specter of spot zoning, and it's
Yes.
generally speaking something that is a greater concern in theory than in reality. So people, when they make these, municipalities, when they make these kinds of changes, want to avoid a situation where only one property is eligible for it. So, I mean, I didn't count up just how many, but it was probably not many more than 2 property owners. But that's better than 1, and that's what usually makes people breathe a sigh of relief. They'll say, oh, well, at least it's not spot zoning. Well, it probably wasn't spot zoning to begin with, but the perception is easier when it's not just one property.
But did they express any kind of a concern, like if you lower the threshold, what would be the unintended or intended consequences of that kind of? So if you lower it to 50 acres, let's
Yeah.
say.
Well, that'll be the conversation that you could have if you consider it as one of things that you want to explore. Back then, I don't know what the discussion was, but back then, it was only a couple of possible properties in the entire town.
I mean, that's an
And one of
easy,
them was looking for it.
that's an easy thing to add as a recommended action
Gesundheit.
for us to at least consider, right? I mean,
Well, it's also
The rural
an easy thing
mixed-use
to study the
PUD.
implications of just by playing around
Right.
with this tool. Because, the red are 10-plus lots, signify 10-plus lots. So-
Gross development, you're netting out, that's less than the absolute acreage. That's based on the removal of the mapped wetlands,
Yeah.
flood hazard
Notable
areas,
area.
and slopes over
Yeah.
15%.
yeah.
So it's, it's at least 50-plus acres.
Yeah, it's a conservative estimate of the area, absolutely.
Yeah, but, and probably more than that, because not all of these parcels are created equally, but you could start to play with what-ifs very
Oh,
easily
yeah.
with this zoning tool by maybe taking the red and the sort of in between the pink and the red out, and sort of, playing with that. And then suggesting, well, what does that suggest and where does that suggest? That could be a way to sort of identify potential, a criteria for identifying potential places that might be suitable for these hamlets.
Yeah, right now, I believe the primary threshold that gets you in is the size, but you could consider others.
Or you could consider lowering the size. to-
Right,
Right.
yeah, I
Right.
mean that in addition to.
Yeah.
So if there was some thought about, well, in the future, if we're going to allow them to be on smaller lots, we'll want to make sure that those lots have the following features. Will you come up with those 3 features?
So let's let Kate get through the balance of
Oh, let's see.
the objectives here. So we were on 5, right? We got through,
Yeah.
we talked about hamlets. I interrupted you and asked about nodes.
Yeah,
And then we had some great input from our friends here now.
Yeah, and then an overlay map, so start with, and that could be something that stands in stark contrast to this this map, right, just for starters, just.
Right.
And,
And does that map, is that just the rural district that's showing? What is- What's the outside perimeter here? Is this,
Well, the dark center is the sewer service area, and so that's the village growth area and the growth area one.
Okay.
And everything else is outside of that.
Yeah.
It includes the rural zoning district and the conservation zoning district. And I have the layers on, I could flip those through.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, Kate, keep going.
Anyway, it's just, I think we can start to very objectively look at some of the, facts on the ground and implications of current zoning and start to use that to, and I think, again, to guide what we suggest for what would be in these various sections of the overlay map, which are really only 3. The document that I think should guide that really should be the open space plan, at least to start with. And then, and then once there's some consensus on how to move forward on this, I think start to translate the vision, priorities, and desired outcomes, clarify what is meant in each area so that we can start to inform a zoning bylaw, which I would hope would be a unified bylaw. I mean, I think this is where a unified bylaw would be incredibly useful to have. So maybe putting the cart before the horse.
What do you mean by a unified bylaw?
That is it's a bylaw that integrates subdivision and zoning. So right now, you have to look in 2 different documents depending on what you want to do, and it's just cumbersome, and they're not integrated, and they're out of alignment, or contradictory. So this has everything kind of integrated. And because the bylaws really are the zoning is more, at this point, more concerned about use, and then the subdivision regulations tell you more about, how the land has to be treated in a certain way. So if you can integrate those 2 things together, I think you get a better outcome. I mean, it's kind of, logical. Let's see. And then I think also to maybe have as an objective a design, some kind of a design guide, particularly where the infill development might be occurring. And then
So would that be district-wide, or are you thinking more for the hamlets?
I think more for the hamlets. Really kind of be very specific about the form in the hamlets, really, get more into the architectural outcomes that you want, and, we could get into things that really matter in terms of how a place is defined, like the width of the roads and
Right.
stuff like that, so you have this nice rural feel. I mean, I think it would be really kind of fun to explore having kind of agricultural PUDs, I mean, farming is the new golf, right? And then I think in the rural and agricultural sector and in the conservation sector, maybe what drives what the design of those subdivisions, we're more concerned about how they're located, not so much micromanaging the design of them. We want to make sure that they're not going to interfere with farming. They're not going to be, that the best resources are going to be, not compromised by this in some way. And I would think that would become even more the case in the conservation areas. But, kind of leave it up to a developer to figure out what the houses actually look like. So I guess that's a way of saying highest level of, design rigor in the hamlet areas, less so in the agricultural and conservation areas. But I would think that would be where the Natural Resources Committee and the Housing Committee working together could really help us develop what some of those criterias are. And there's some great resources, Randall Arendt's, book on conservation subdesign. I think I had a couple of, images in here.
Yeah, I was going to ask you,
Yeah. So.
What's this one? Yeah,
This one?
talk us
So
through
this would be, okay, so imagine on the left, that's just a piece of raw land.
Mm-hmm.
And so on the right, it shows 3 different possible ways that this could be developed. And so the first is just conventional slap-down 5-acre zoning. So this is
Right.
a little bit, I'm cheating a little bit. This is a little misleading for Shelburne, because
Mm-hmm.
once you are at 4, or is it, are we 4 or more?
In the rural district?
Yeah, I forget
No,
which
you
town
have to
I'm
have
in.
6.
6, okay.
More
It's-
than
it-
5 will be mandatory as a PUD.
Okay, Westford is 4. I forget which town I'm in.
So 6.
So 6, at 6, then you've, the DRB really gets actively involved. You've got PUDs kicking
Yes.
in. So one of the things that Dick had mentioned was, how about making everything a PUD in certain parts of the rural area, so that everything gets that kind of really, high degree of review and needing to comply with standards. So we're
Single lot.
yeah,
PUD.
that's what he was
Okay.
saying. So we're at 6 now, maybe each and every one is too much. Maybe that would not be tolerated, but maybe we could go to 2 or 3 or something like that, which would be a big improvement. Anyway,
Okay.
so the top image is the most unenlightened thing possible. It's just slapped down on the land. And then the next model would be kind of a conventional way that a lot of, sort of nicer subdivisions in the 90s were done. We have plenty of these all over the place, right? And then in the bottom area is something that's more maybe south, what's the place in Burlington called?
In Burlington or South?
South Burlington.
South Village.
South Village is kind of maybe, somewhat of an example of.
Of the middle one?
No, of the bottom one.
Oh, the bottom.
Yeah. So where South Village, they actually do have a working farm of some
Right.
kind there. So, so it's just a way of looking at how you organize this. So that, the bottom one would be potentially kind of an example of like a hamlet. With the remaining portions of the land could be, public and accessible. I mean, we could be getting our walking paths everywhere and not having to worry about figuring out how to put them on the roads, so.
So what does the group generally think about this notion of conservation, ag, hamlet overlay district? I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about proposing, as far as how do we change, when we're looking at the town plan rural section itself. I think, do we start framing up this concept? Is that something that the group supports? Are there concerns or thoughts, questions?
I support it. I just get tripped up when I start thinking about how we would do that. I love the idea.
Yeah, and I think that's what I want to confirm first. Do we like this idea? Because how we do it is not necessarily
Our problem now.
short-term. No, it's not our problem now, really. It's figuring out, how do we build language that supports doing this at some point down the road, right? Because we'll have to, once we get to a point where we include this language and we start to have public hearings about it, I think this is a topic that will certainly provoke a lot of people in the room and dialogue, which is a good thing.
Yeah, and even last week, there was a fair amount of discussion. I think it was Andrew that suggested a build-out study as one of the grant things, where if you took all of the land that's in Shelburne now and you divided it up in the rural district, and you divided it into the 5-acre zoning that it is, and you plopped a house on all of those 5 acres, what would the town look like?
Right.
And I think most would agree that that gets away from the character preservation that Kate is talking about. So being able to preserve that in a way that is not going to significantly cause a ruckus amongst owners of large tracts of land. Yeah, I've been thinking about a lot of different things. I like where all of this is. It just it's easier when you have a big chunk of property, like the example we were talking about. I think it gets more difficult when you have lots of, say, 20-acre properties, and then how do you do that, and how can you combine it? So I definitely love the idea. I just get really tripped up mentally when I try and think about solutions, which is not what we're trying to do right now.
And for me, I'm thinking there's a map, right? I mean, that's what an overlay district is ultimately. So it's going to be developing the boundaries of these. And I like this idea of priority areas, right? It doesn't sound like a hard and fast transition zones are where we always have the most tension. And this priority area concept, I like the idea of maybe
And
figuring out a way to have some overlap between a hamlet and an ag zone transition and not being a hard and fast line necessarily. I don't know if you can do that because you have.
I mean, when Kate and I talked about this maybe 2-3 weeks ago, and that was, I think, in that conversation was this idea of the overlay that came up. And at the time, I wasn't thinking of a map that was particularly blobby. I was thinking of a map that was in addition to the future land use map, that is the requirement of the plan. And that's the thing that people might be pretty twitchy about. But if this new map was put in terms of being an overlay, something that's the 50-year vision rather than the 8-year vision, people might be less wigged out about it. But if it's the sort of thing that people might be really wigged out regardless, it could be blobby. So that it's not necessarily going to be something that we'd use the computer to draw, but would still communicate this idea that there will be these node or hamlet areas, and they are going to overlap into this other surrounding rural area. But we also have these conservation areas, and they're going to be bigger than what we have right now. So the basic concept is communicated, but hopefully in a non-threatening way. And if people buy into it, that's what I think, you're looking for, is that there's a consensus. Yeah, this is where you want to go.
I think one of the things is it's for many people, it's still really an abstraction what this purple looks like, because right now, this is indicative of potential, but a lot of it has not really been built out. I mean, I am one of the things I'm hoping that the recent clearing on the Rice lumber site indicates is, what is an example of what's at stake. The Snyder thing has been kind of, at Quiniesca proposal, has been sort of put on hold for a while. That degree of change has been alarming to some. I think that, we have a kind of mini version of that happening right now with the development of the Rice lumber property, which I could hear crystal clear, the construction from my house, down on the other side of the cliffs. So I think showing people what is at stake and what could happen has a lot of merit. And then getting their buy-in, well, what do you want to have happen here? And we're at a crossroads. The choice is ours, how we're going to proceed in the future. And if we can get consensus on we want a certain kind of future vision, then it becomes, okay, how do we get there? But at least if we can keep relating back to that, so that I think that's going to be really important, to have something really concrete, a concrete vision to, if there is such a thing, a concrete vision, organizing principle to relate back to, so that people, we have a way to, when somebody says, you're just making this up and pulling this out of thin air, we can say, no, we're not. You can go back and say that this has been informed by what people have said and they want.
Can I offer a couple things? So, Kate, I think your intuition that chart of the 3 development strategies is a powerful kind of rhetorical device. I think that's a good intuition. I think everyone has had the experience of being in suburbia and really not liking the feel of that. So I think if you can say to people, this is going to happen unless we do otherwise, I think that trust that intuition. And then, Jason, I understand your concern about this, like, it sounds great, but like, how would we actually like legislate something like that in practice? And I think if you think about the beautiful hamlets in Europe, the reason they're so beautiful is that they weren't planned. They grew over time. Step by step, a decision here, each decision trying to improve the context, putting a bench here, planting a tree there, putting a fountain here. And so they have this quality of almost feeling like part of nature, like they kind of organically grew. And yet the concept of planning seems like antithetical to that, because you're trying to kind of decide ahead of time all the possible uses and list those out. So I wonder what it would be like, just as an exercise, if the Planning Commission, for this particular case of encouraging hamlets to grow, if you could think in terms of defining a process rather than defining an outcome. So rather than giving a list of the kinds of things that you can put there, have certain guidelines for how decisions get made. And put the process in the code, and then allow the process to unfold a hamlet that ends up feeling organic and alive and like part of nature. So I don't know exactly what that process would be, but just thinking about process versus outcome might produce a more beautiful and organic result in the case of hamlets.
Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I just very, very quickly, I mean, with all due respect, yes, a lot of those hamlets are centuries old, but there's something called the Town and Country Planning Act that was adopted in England, and there was post-World War II legislation that limited development in the rural areas, and the entirely different system of property ownership. And I've spent time studying communities in England, so, I mean, I think there's a lot for us to learn. We have a slightly different setting for it. So
Yes.
we have to deal with the system that we have. But in terms of the aesthetic that we might try to strive for, they're great models. But process alone is not responsible for what's happened there. And we can prove that just by the fact that a lot of those laws are changing, and we're seeing them stressing from some of the same things that are affecting us, with a lot more automobile use and a lot more suburbanization and things like that. Watch the BBC series The Planners. If you can find it online, you'll get a taste.
I will.
I have had some thoughts and some concerns also
Okay.
about the ultimate look or growth of something like this, because
Of an
my-
overlay district?
yeah, I mean, I love the ideas that we're talking about, but I think that that we have to be thinking forward at the same time as we're thinking today. And my concern is, what I've seen in the 45 years or so that I've lived here, is that we're constantly doing a little more infill. And so as we develop these areas and as we build our zoning laws, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that planning commissions will change and select boards will change and laws will change. And as we grow, there's going to be an instinct to do infill to where these new settlements are. And so if we don't think at the same time as we're doing these kinds of little hamlets, which I think are really great in an organic kind of way to do things, if we don't think about actual conservation of the land the other land around it, that's the conservation district or the agricultural district, that we'll be doing a good thing for our generation, but what will happen in the next generation? So I know when we talk on Natural Resources Committee about the different kinds of land protection, in our original open space plan back in 2006, we talked a little bit about the levels of conservation, and there's perpetual conservation by a third-party organization, and then there's conservation of a neighborhood, which can change because the neighborhood is in control of that. And then there are deeds that protect certain pieces of land. So I think that it's going to be important to be really thoughtful as we develop these kinds of new concepts to make sure that the protection that we're trying to achieve is actually protected long-term.
Right.
You follow me?
Yeah, I do. I think the thing I always come back to with this conversation is 5-acre zoning's not working. What's a solution, right? What's another way to do that without saying, okay, now it's 10 acres? Because that may not end up with the best outcomes either. For us, I mean, I think when Kate's framed this up, I like this idea of anchoring everything in the open space plan, right? Sort of a pyramid at the top, the conservation's at the top, the open space plan sort of sets the stage for what follows. You have this ag layer that could include a lot of different things, right? Whether it's more work on the integrated ag bylaw, whether it's, new techniques or other ideas that surface, and then this hamlet idea still resonates a little bit with me because I think that's the pattern we have now, and I think if we want to try to maintain, preserve sort of the character of the town, I think we, at some level, have to embrace that. Where I get nervous is I don't want to have to worry now about what does that mean if we say, yes, we have an overlay district that includes hamlets. I don't think we necessarily have to worry about, does that mean the sewer service area boundary changes? Right now, we have a policy statement that says it doesn't, but does that conflict with saying, hey, we might identify this area as a potential hamlet? I don't know, but I don't know if we necessarily have to solve that as part of our.
I'm not contradicting that, I guess, and this emerged from a conversation I had with Dean, and I may be misinterpreting where he got me thinking. But that even as we get further out into the rural district and the conservation district, perhaps we do have places where people have a larger lot, but maybe the entire lot is not theirs in perpetuity, or not theirs, although they may have a larger home there, and they may have a larger distance between them and the next house. That the land around them is conserved rather than part of their yard.
On private property?
Not be private, that it might not all be private property.
Okay.
That they may be in an area that might be designated as 25 acres or 10 acres or 5 acres or whatever it is, but that their building envelope doesn't necessarily, their building envelope becomes what they own, and the rest of it around them is conserved in a more perpetual way than having it be part of their
Want me to try to shed
land.
some light on what might have caused your thinking? At least I.
Yes.
Okay. So, yes, Gail and I had a conversation the other day, and it was prompted by a kind of small subdivision that gave rise to some of these issues. And what I said was a possibility in the future with some alternate regulatory scheme is, let's say we do what Dick says. Every subdivision is a PUD. Okay. So then if everything is a PUD, we would look at this 2-lot subdivision that involves this large piece with a lot of resource lands, and we'd say, okay, you've got to follow the PUD provisions. Well, we've acknowledged, I think, that those need some tightening up. They need to be clearer and perhaps more aggressive when it comes to the open space requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, the open space requirement can be met by a separate parcel, or the open space requirement can be part of the parcels that are in the lot. So one possible change would be to say, no, this idea that the open space is met by land that's retained in the parcel is no longer going to be the case. The open space will be a separate lot. So that moves us in a direction that's different from the one that we are in right now. Some subdivisions result in what's called an open space agreement. So when you do a PUD and you have an open space lot, how does the town know it's going to be left open and not, used as a landfill? Well, that's often accomplished by something called an open space agreement that is essentially an easement. But it's not a feature of those agreements to give rights of access. It's really, it addresses the town's interest through the assurance that it will remain natural, but it doesn't mean that it become public. So you've moved from this place where, maybe people are driving their four-wheelers around this space that was once considered open space, and policing that is really difficult, to one where it's its own lot and the town has this open space, this right, basically, although it isn't a right to get on there with trails necessarily. I'm not sure that I'm at the point where I'd be recommending we go much further than that, because you get into some dicey legal areas. But maybe, over time, if all subdivisions, including those in the rural area, had to be PUDs, they had to have open space. The open space area was a larger percentage of the total than it is now. And it used to be higher. It dropped, but it could go back up. Then maybe over time, people would say, this open space, I'm managing it. The town has this open space easement on it. I might as well turn it over to a third party. And that's moving more to where I think Kate and some on the Natural Resources Committee think would be kind of the gold standard
Right.
for conservation, but it wouldn't happen immediately.
And we could even start
That's
by
helpful.
looking at certain areas where maybe right off the bat, there are certain portions of the town, like the areas that have high conservation value, everything has to be a PUD. Like, right, you have the most rigorous standards for that. I mean, this could be a process for how we get there, because this is going to be a big change, and people are going to have to get used to it. And then, in terms of, we're also kind of talking about reducing perhaps the amount of density in certain areas and encouraging more density in some other areas. So transfer of development rights
Yep.
may be something that we need to look at as a mechanism. And again, I'm thinking that,
That was a topic we had talked about with the housing subcommittee.
yeah.
Iteration, maybe that's an area where they could help marshal some knowledge and help us study that.
Right, and present this in a compelling way to landowners so that they see the advantages of this. That, if we look at how we use land in the aggregate in the rural areas, we're creating value that everybody will benefit from by having this more comprehensive approach. So we don't have this ad hoc kind of creeping, suburbanization stuff going on, which ends up, if you live near that devalues your property,
So let's do this. We're coming up on 9 o'clock soon. How do we progress this rural district? One thing I would like to see when we continue the rural conversation is the future land use map. I think that would be helpful for us.
The current future land
Yeah.
use map?
I think that would be helpful for us just within the packet the next time.
Okay.
Because I want to continue to.
It's the whole
I think we should
series
go
or just
back
the one?
to, Kate, thank you for this work, by the way.
Sure.
If we were to sort of take this concept and go back to the current rural area section in the town plan and start making some tweaks, do you think it's premature to do that? Do you want to spend more time fleshing out some of these concepts, or how would you like to proceed with this section, since
almost
your
thinking-
name's on it with Dick and he's not here?
Yeah,
so-
I was almost thinking about this as something that we might take up, here's just a thought, at our retreat with you guys. Like how to start to align this with the open space plan. To me, that seems to be the best way to go, because that is been publicly approved and sanctioned. And I think the degree to which we can couch a change that is going to be pretty profound for a lot of people, align it with this existing document that has been endorsed by our elected officials, and I think that's the best way to sort of start to think about, and I think we'll be able to identify areas that should be, right off the bat, maximally protected, and then we can start to kind of chip away from there, and then I think in terms of deciding what how we decide where hamlets might go. I don't even know if that's really
I don't think we need to do that as part of the Town
this
plan
update.
I think, unless I'm thinking about it the wrong way. I mean, I don't envision us actually getting into the tactical development of the overlay district itself.
So I think we're
I think the
talking about two
concept.
different kinds of overlay district. So when I was talking about it with Kate, the idea was to develop an overlay district that's actually something that is a feature of the town plan.
Okay.
And
Well,
so it doesn't
that's
mean that you
helpful
have to do
because I was
that, but
picturing
that
it
was
as-
the idea.
But this could
As
be
more of a
something
bylaw.
more fuzzy, you know?
Right, that's
Where it
what
has more
Bobby-
fuzzy areas, like areas with potential to be both rural agriculture and hamlet, that kind of thing. Because I think that we may, as we get into this and people start to buy into the idea of kind of controlling our own destiny and for this, and become more persuaded of that this has benefits for everybody and advantages, I think we may have folks starting to show some interest in, hey, I want to be a hamlet, kind of like you guys are. Like, well, we're all over, potentially, all over that idea for our land. And, and there'll be some places where people have no interest in it. And I think we can sort of flush some of that out. I think, but predicting where those areas are, I have no idea
Right.
how to do that.
Well, let's
But,
do that. I like
yeah.
that idea of, we'll convene with the Natural Resources Committee. I think we should extend the invite to the Housing Subcommittee members.
And if we have all these experts on the housing committee who are, in the real estate experts, they can really guide like where this makes sense from a sort of, knowledge of the market, knowledge of stuff that we don't, really have expertise in. They can, I think, be pretty potent combination, the combination of their expertise with
Okay.
yours.
Schedule and future topics.
Well, one of my reasons for suggesting that as an agenda item was that we still have to keep in mind the deadline for the
Yes.
updating the town plan. And the idea that I wanted to get out on the table was something that may be happening on its own, and that is, instead of having things happening sequentially, having things happening in multiple channels. And as we set loose the housing committee to work on something and set loose the energy group.
Yeah, I like that.
I wondered if that was something that you wanted to consider, because if it was, then I would take a hard look at the schedule and try to come up with something that that did that. Because the longer it's taking to really work out the future land use piece and not make a lot of what I'm thinking of as the concrete progress on the document. And we have this question that came up in the discussion last time about the energy policies that are in the transportation part of the plan, and then the energy things that are in the energy, and where would they end up? I'm still operating under the assumption that the basic structure is not going to change. We'd had dreams of, but the longer we go. with
Yeah,
that-
no, I think we agreed to not.
Okay, so that
Rework.
idea of channels with different groups working on them, and it could even go as far as just making sure that we say to Betsy downstairs, can your rec committee be
Yes.
tasked with? And it gets a little bit, the school board, education, or I've typically worked with people like Bob Mesa, just deliberately doing that so that you have more time to do the high-level discussions and not be doing catch-up, because
No, I agree.
afraid.
I think
very afraid.
these are two big boulders, energy and
Yeah,
rural.
they
So
are.
I'm okay taking a little more time on these.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
you need
they're
to.
really important and they will require more input. But I'd like this idea of just having multiple tracks, right? Like, let's let the rural piece take its course, as well as energy, and get the right people in the room working on these sections.
Because you have
Almost.
liaison
Right.
reps, and I think that since you've done that, charge that person with wrestling that piece.
So maybe we should put a couple of the ones that we haven't addressed yet on the next agenda, right? I think we'll park the rural district for our
Retreat.
joint retreat, right? the energy, let's get the
Committee.
Energy Committee up and running and start them on that piece, since I think we've done good work on that section, and it's time for another set of eyes to look at that.
So
Why don't we
maybe
just
one of the next-
identify a couple
Yeah,
new sections,
historic
whether
and
it's
cultural resources.
education, historic, cultural resources.
Yeah, and that raises the HBDRC as a possible
Sure,
player. And I'm not sure exactly which one I would say in addition. It might be rec, although
We looked at that. Didn't Andrew do that?
we did daycare and we did do rec, that's right.
Yep.
And so if there's nothing that you want to go back and revisit with that, education, transportation is a biggie. Those are just some of them.
Okay. Great. Next agenda item is updates from staff. An update on the municipal planning grant.
Yeah, the select board has received the word from the planning commission after or as part of the last meeting. I took from that beginning work on a planning grant application that would focus on a survey and focus groups. And I have had contact with 2 different consultants who will be contributing to the budget. The select board signed the resolution. And
Great.
so the one thing that I want to have before you leave is to get your signature on the
Yes.
resolution. And that will go in by October 2nd, because that's the deadline.
Excellent.
The other thing that was on.
Form-based zoning.
I'm still.
Brandy.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned, frankly, about what's going on with Brandy. I did get a word from her immediately after this big conference I know that she was involved in, and she promised me some things last week I didn't get, and I haven't heard back from her. So I'm trying to
Okay.
figure out what's going on.
Did she, I know we still need to.
You and I were gonna talk,
Convene.
and she was gonna be getting to me some of the things that she's been working on that were going to be easy things.
Okay,
And-
got it. So she has a couple
Yeah, she had indicated
deliverables still.
back in early
Yeah.
August.
Is the RPC, is Lee
I haven't, I haven't
reaching
said, hey,
out
Lee,
to,
go
like,
beat on
close this
her.
out, or no?
Well, Lee and I did check in, or Lee checked in with me, and I copied him on some stuff, and so he seemed satisfied, but I haven't gone back to him to say I'm, a little concerned.
Okay. Well, you and I will
Tomorrow too.
put our heads together at 2 tomorrow, and hopefully Brandy resurfaces, and we'll update the group at the next meeting on hopefully closing out that engagement. Next item is commissioner questions and comments. Anything?
I just have a comment just quickly about
Please.
this survey planning grant. I think that we discussed extensively the survey, but just based on today's conversation about this planned comparative models of rural growth that you presented, I think it would be very interesting to kind of like develop some kind of like a choice experiment where you can put in this picture that was, the Kate just showed that one, kind of like, and have people rank them, but you can also like list different benefits, like say in terms of like more sustainable versus less sustainable, but there are different trade-offs across
Yeah.
different, and you can list those attributes for each one of those choices. That's typically known as choice experiments. So you can embed them in your survey instrument.
Yeah, we did something
Visual
like that as
preference.
part of a survey for a study a couple of years ago.
Visual
Yeah.
preference survey,
With
right?
some different land use options, so we could do that again. Knock on wood, it would be,
Yeah, I meant to say like more specifically about this particular model of Hamlet,
Yeah.
rural growth model that we're talking about.
Visual
Yeah.
preference.
A visual
Yes.
preference,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So we can get more very concrete feedback from the people about that.
yeah.
And similarly about energy siting, you can do similar stuff, but it's just an idea.
I agree. I think that syncs up well with how I'm thinking about it needs to be visual.
Yeah,
A narrative survey won't be very effective, and we
Right.
won't get a good response rate, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, that way we can also really get into the character of the area kinds of things.
Yes.
Some of the
Yeah,
things
yeah.
that John was talking about with, the sweet little benches and little
Right.
stone towers and things. And in Britain, we have our own Yankee equivalents, right? So,
I mean, even in putting this in your planning grant proposal would make your proposal more competitive because they'll know that you're not just saying, we'll design a survey, but
Well,
Exactly.
this will be our third. So
I see.
Third
we've-
shot.
so you're sure to get
We've
it?
done,
Yeah.
we've done okay with our survey grant application.
yeah.
I just have a thought.
Yes,
In the context of what you were just talking about, having something that's visual as a survey, but then if the grant would allow it to have another component of it, which would be an actual participatory one, where you might have people come into the room and have a conversation.
So just to reiterate, the grant application is
I know it's
built
due in
around
about a week, right?
surveys. No. This is actually good news. It's seeking funds to do a survey, and then a separate piece is focus groups. So the consultants that I've been working with, one would be helping us on the survey piece, and another does a lot of focus groups. So this idea of getting people in the room and having something different from a survey is an explicit part of it. That came about as a result of the discussion last time.
Yeah, and I think we did that in advance of the first publication of the first open space plan, and I think it was very helpful to the process.
You mean back with Paula Cope? I mean, going
Yeah.
way back?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it did get a lot of people engaged who might not just fill out a survey.
Yeah. That's going way back, actually.
No
When-
questions?
Can I just
comments?
ask, Gail, when did the budget item, when did that start of voting each year on the ballot?
I have records that probably go back as far as about 1980 something.
Really?
I could send you, because every year when we do our request, I send a history,
Yeah.
and I could send you the history page. And maybe if I send it to one of you, you can circulate it.
I think that would be really neat to put in the town plan, just as evidence of how important this is to our community.
How it's changed and vacillated from really good support to minimal support.
Well, and then what we've achieved, I think that would be really useful to have in the,
I can send you that data.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
I think it might be
Again,
sensitive content
so
a
this
little
is
bit,
not
but-
coming out of, this is not like Kate's just making this up kind of stuff,
Right.
This
It's
is
factual and it's
There's this coming from.
public.
Yeah.
Okay. Lastly, we did want to confirm the Planning Commission Natural Resources Joint Retreat date,
And we've had everyone respond.
which seems to be Monday, October 30th.
Yes, we have.
Okay.
We would have only one person who cannot make that date.
Okay,
and
I
that
think
is
that's,
That is the vice chair. And Kyle, actually, on the Natural Resources Committee. So one representative of each group is unable to
Okay.
attend on Monday the 30th. So the next question, if the date is the 30th, is location.
yes, we have a lot of people.
And-
I think I can check the calendar.
Do we have enough room, you think, up there?
We can see, I have tables and chairs for
Okay.
30 or more.
Okay. Yeah.
That'd be
As
great.
long as we
Thanks,
know
Gail.
that
Yeah.
room is are you able to confirm the time right now, or the availability?
Now, yeah. Monday nights are usually pretty good nights. It's the night before Halloween.
Yes.
Yeah, the only thing on my calendar is the retreat.
Good. Sounds like a plan.
And I will get the word out to Ron then and the housing
Yes,
committee
please,
members.
thank
to-
you. Do you, I mean, we have a little time on that, so
Yeah,
we'll start sketching out an agenda
And
too,
he-
just so we have some structure around
Yeah.
the conversation. If you have ideas that surface that you'd like to address, let's just talk amongst us and
and-
we'll start framing up the agenda.
yeah, and just so that, it's a retreat, it is a public meeting. It is a public meeting.
Yeah,
so these
absolutely
are
open.
quorums, so.
Yeah.
So feel free.
Just a general question, what's the best way to have a voice in this unfolding process? Like, is it mainly coming to these meetings, or?
I'm afraid so.
Definitely,
Yeah.
yeah. It's
You
the
can
best
go
way to
home.
do it. I think there are other ways. I think, communicating through any of us will be an option. I think through Dean works well, which I think you've done, and they're public meetings, so we'll do our best to make you aware of when the topic's coming up. If there are other things that are of interest, I know the rural district generally seems to be a priority, but if there are other topics, we can, yes, historic and
maybe that would be.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the town plan's on the website. If you haven't looked at it, there is a historic and cultural resources section, and so that's the one that we're talking about. There is a Preservation and Design Review Commission, which has a role in reviewing projects here in the village core, and that's the group that I was referring to. There is also a historical society, and maybe both of them
Right.
would have a role.
So the retreat thing, really, you could like just rock up and take part in that?
Sure, yeah, it'd be great.
The more the merrier.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're public meetings, so it's Gail's place.
Yeah.
What's your favorite
She's,
bylaw?
she's gracious enough to host us, but,
Love it.
good. Okay, any other business?
That was 7 to 9, was it?
Six, I think,
Six. We talked about 6:30 to.
yeah, 6:30
or
to 9.
6?
I think,
Pizza?
if that's the request.
So,
Yeah. why
yeah,
not?
6:30 to 9, okay, so we'll make that happen. Any other business? No correspondence, I assume.
Nothing that I have in
Nothing,
my packet
okay.
right here, but like
We
I said, I
will-
do want to make sure you have the.
Consider a motion to adjourn.
So moved?
Moved by Kate, seconded by Jason, all in favor? Aye. Thanks, everybody.